I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 86 of EO Radio Show. This is our 13th in a series of quick tip episodes focusing on the details of state registration of nonprofit corporations. In previous episodes, we talked about filing in Delaware and California, which are the most frequently used by our clients, most of whom have a connection with California. Other episodes have focused on the state filings in Nevada, Arizona, Washington State, Oregon, Alaska, Hawaii, New York and New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maine, Vermont, Rhode Island and New Hampshire, Florida, Louisiana, and most recently, North Carolina, South Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, Oklahoma, and Texas. So that's a long list. We have clients in all of these jurisdictions, and so they all become relevant from time to time. With the help of Joe Hilliard, today we look at the basic state filing requirements for nonprofit corporations operating in New Mexico and Utah. You can find all the prior episodes on our website or at the Farella YouTube channel, where there is a playlist just for state filing requirements. We'll work our way through the rest of the states in future episodes. Also, starting with this episode, we'll plan to update listeners on the changes in state laws for the states that we've already covered. So we'll try to keep you all up to date. Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. As we discussed in previous episodes, nonprofit corporations are one variety of fictitious business entities. Others include partnerships and limited liability companies, or LLCs. The laws of all the states prescribe certain formalities that organizers of these business entities must go through so that the entity can be regulated and subject to legal process as if it were a person. Since business enterprises aren't natural persons, the laws have developed mechanisms for treating them like natural persons. This is where the state filings come into play. In order for the organizers of these fictitious entities to take advantage of the protection of the laws, they have to provide notice as to the legal name, the state whose jurisdiction they are claiming for corporate organization laws, a physical address where they can be served with legal process, and certain other information. In this episode, we aren't going to dive deep into the pros and cons for where to incorporate, but instead we are focusing on issues like the ease of formation, standardized documents that are available, filing fees, and similar matters. As with all the states we have discussed, if you do business as a nonprofit in New Mexico or Utah, or solicit charitable contributions there, even if just through the nonprofit corporation's website, the nonprofit may need to have a legal presence and be registered in these two states. For the details on these states, we welcome back Joe Hilliard. Joe is a senior paralegal at Farella, and he specializes in formation and compliance matters for all manner of entities, and in particular charities that are tax-exempt under Internal Revenue Code Section 501c3. Prior to working at Farella, he worked in-house for several real estate development and management companies in Southern California, working on real estate purchases and vendor contracting. So, Joe, as I mentioned in the opening remarks, let's start our episode today, and probably in future episodes, let's start with updates on the state laws for states that we've already covered in previous episodes. I see that there were some changes to Connecticut rules that will become effective next January. Tell us a little bit about what you've learned there and how that may be important to our listeners.
Yes, for sure. And it's good to be back again. Yes, since we recorded last, which was in early June, the Connecticut governor signed into law, and it's effective January 1st, 2025, new registration laws for your entities. Among the changes, now all business entities must include a valid email address and their NAICS code with certain filings. This is something new that we've seen from them. And then amended annual reports must be filed if the information changes after the most current reports within 30 days before the next month is due. And the Secretary of State is now authorized to require online filings and allow paper filings only if the filer establishes online submissions as impractical. So this is something we've not seen. We've seen some states where we've said that they've gone to all electronic before, but this is something new here in Connecticut. Then it says that the Secretary of State will use the email notifications to take certain actions, like an administrative dissolution. So if you miss your filing and they dissolve you administratively, which some states will do, I didn't look at Connecticut specifically, but some states will do within 30 days of missing, like your annual report, they will dissolve you. We saw that when we talked about New York, for instance. And so if that's their primary contact, you need to really make sure you've got your emails updated.
So this is really interesting as I think about it, is kind of pick your poison. If all notices, official notices are coming only by email, you better be sure that it's not caught in a spam filter and that somebody actually monitors the email box. On the other hand, we all know from the past 4 years, I can't believe it's been 4 years now, it was really hard to get paper mail for a long time when we couldn't go into, when we were all quarantined. So it would be really nice if it were both paper and email, and that makes it less likely that you'll miss things. But more importantly, I guess that really puts the pressure on internal calendaring procedures and making sure that wherever you're registered and filing reports, you keep yourself up to date, because you may or may not hear from the state.
We went through that here internally a little over a year ago when the office physically moved and we had to change the address for every business that we used as it had our identification on that. So it's definitely something to think about. And two, we've had that where the states want an email address, like when I do my California Secretary of State, and to us having an internal email that multiple people have access to versus having it tied to someone's singular email.
Yeah. An important takeaway here is that if you're dissolved by the state for failure to file, that's a big deal. The organization is no longer qualified to do business and can't take advantage of the protection of the laws. It's not just a simple thing. So it is really important to attend to these filing requirements. So with all that intro, let's talk a little bit about New Mexico, and then we'll close out the episode with Utah. Joe, tell us about the document you used to form a nonprofit corporation in New Mexico.
For sure. So in New Mexico, we're back to our normals. The Secretary of State governs New Mexico entity formations. And for a domestic nonprofit corporation, they have a form, Articles of Incorporation. It's a simple 3-page form. It has a lot of the basics we always talk about, your name, your address. But as always, it has some state-specific quirks. Article 1, beyond the name, also asks for, and this is what we just talked about, Connecticut being new. Here in Mexico already has an email address and a phone number, both request in the actual Articles of Incorporation. So they're asking for some front-loaded information to get to be in contact with you. Article 2 asks for the purpose, and then further has a checkbox for whether this corporation elects to be designated as a benefit corporation pursuant to the local New Mexico codes 53-12-7 under the NMSA, the New Mexico Act. This is a reminder, again, to look at the state-specific rules if you are going to be having a benefit corporation part to you in New Mexico. And then if this is yes, the Article 2 then has a further fill-in where you need to explain why you're going to be a benefit corporation. Article 5 asks for the names and addresses of all the board of directors and notes that a minimum of 3 must be identified. Article 6 asks for the name and address of all the incorporators. No limit here, though. It can be just one. I know we've seen several states recently that ask for 3 incorporators, but here we only need to have 1. Then the third page is a statement of acceptance of your registered agent, which needs to be signed. This, again, is a bit unusual. Usually a state just has them name, and there's like a checkbox saying, yes, this person agreed to be the agent. But here, the individual or an entity, if you're using a service, will have to actually sign this. You can't just sit right down at your computer, type it up, and go and be ready for that. Note, too, here, there's not really a good space for our 501c3 dissolution language we would like that's in the form. And so here, again, the state does allow for you to file your own drafted articles as long as it meets all these criteria. So here, not unlike California, we would probably recommend, rather than use the fill-in form, to actually do a draft as a Word document printed out like we do, again, where we would have articles put out 1, 2, 3, 4, identify all these items, but have it typed out rather than use the form so that we could have this additional 501c3 language.
So talk about foreign corporations, corporation organized in other states that want to do business in New Mexico. What's the application like there to become qualified to do business in New Mexico?
There, New Mexico has what they call their Foreign Nonprofit Corporation Application for a Certificate of Authority. This is also a 3-page form, and the last page is that same document we talked about, the acceptance of the registered agent. So same with the domestic, it asks for email addresses and phone numbers to be put into it. Article 2 has the same benefit corporation questions. Article 5 asks for the initial board with a member also with a minimum of 2 of the officers and a director being named. And as with all the states we've discussed, a good standing certificate from your home state must be attached to this. Since we've been talking about what needs to be done online, here in New Mexico, all limited liability companies have to be submitted online through their web portal. But others, such as what we're talking about here, these articles of incorporation for a nonprofit or the registration, have PDF forms that must be filled out, printed, and then submitted to their office via mail or hand-delivered. And we've got links to the forms themselves in the show notes.
Okay, so you can do it on paper if you're really averse to the electronic filing. So what are the fees and what's the response time look like in New Mexico?
The filing fee for both the domestic and the foreign is only $25, so we're not talking a high cost here. And then the response right now, the websites for the New Mexico Secretary of State don't have the current processing times. Online research in late June showed that it's 2 to 3 weeks for the mailed-in filings. They don't really have an expedite available. Again, we talked about some of the stuff can be done online. There it's 1 to 3 days for the online. But again, if we're talking about printing out, not using the forms and having it printed out and sent in, you're probably several weeks out from when you send it in.
So a lot of incentive to do it online.
Yes.
Are there annual or biannual filings? How often do we have to update the information in New Mexico?
So in New Mexico, all nonprofits have to file an initial report within 30 days of registering. This is actually pretty short. This is closer to what we looked like in Washington, was the only state that was similar to this, versus like here in California where it's 90 days and the primary states where it's only after a year. And so you have to do one within 30 days. And then after that, you have to file an annual report yearly on the 15th day of the 5th month following your fiscal year end date. So you'll identify your end date fiscal year in that initial report due within 30 days. And, so if you're on a calendar year and you end December 31st, your report's due May 15th, not unlike when your IRS 990 would be and most of your other things. So that, and again, we just discussed that the initial report asks for that fiscal year date so that they have an idea of when you'll be filing them.
Right. And so I'm guessing that for this report, there's probably not an automatic extension if you extend your tax return. Yeah. And typically the accounting firms, I don't think, do these annual reports. So it'll be important to calendar it on the internal corporate records to make sure that on that
separate,
on that date, someone checks to make sure that the annual report's done in New Mexico and that the accountants have extended the tax return dates. So 2 things to happen on that 15th day of the 5th month. So the annual fee looks like there's a pretty small fee in New Mexico.
Yeah, much like how the registration was very cheap. Also, the annual fees here are $10. That's again for both the domestic and the foreign. And here these reports are filed online. It's simply a log on. It's a lot of push button, confirm yes, confirm no. If you've changed your officers or directors, you just kind of type in the information. So it's a very fluid, easy document to do online.
So transparency in New Mexico, what do we have to disclose on these annual reports? And then I think let's just go right into the other state agencies, because sometimes what you don't have to tell the Secretary of State, you have to tell someone else. So
this is true. So as we noted, the domestic filing requires the names and addresses of the directors and the incorporator when they start. And then the annual reports will add the officers, and the registration as foreign already had asked for the board and the officers. So this is going to be it. And they don't have any language that says this has to be their home addresses either. This just says a street address. So that's really not, could be an office of any sort, yes. But yes, in other agencies you want to, again, in New Mexico, if you're organized there or you're a foreign corporation which solicits, holds assets, or does business there in the state of New Mexico, you're required to file an additional registration with their Department of Justice. Note here specifically on the website, their DOJ's website, the organization must register with them before soliciting funds in the state. So, they're very specific about that. And organizations that exist and operate in New Mexico also must register within 30 days of the organization's creation, even if they have not begun soliciting. So they really want to make sure here that they've got a list and an idea of what charities, what nonprofits are registered in the state. We kind of hit on that, but this is going to be much more in depth in terms of what you're going to have to attach your IRS determination letter and all your normal documentation and your IRS 990. So those things in there that are publicly available will be going through the New Mexico Department of Justice as well.
All right.
And then if you do need state tax exemptions in New Mexico, you apply through their Department of Taxation and Revenue. I've got links down to them for their specific forms and what they request on both the sales tax and other tax exemptions as well.
So all that'll be in the show notes. along with details about Utah. So let's segue to New Mexico's neighbor to the northwest. Tell us a little bit about filing in Utah and how that state looks at nonprofit corporations.
In Utah, it's the Department of Commerce Division of Corporations and Commercial Code that governs the formation. So it's not run through the Secretary of State here. They have a one-page Articles of Incorporation form. As you would imagine, then it's very basic. It's name, address, registered agent. And this section 2 is a purpose line, but it's very limited in space. It looks like you could type about 50, 70 characters in it at most. Section 4 is for the incorporator, which can only be one, but does allow for more to be noted. Section 5 is a checkbox whether you have members, yes or no. And then Section 6 is a checkbox for the shares if you do have membership in that. And it also notes if you're giving people interest in water or other property rights. It's a very interesting carve-out for a nonprofit to think about. Section 7 is a non-changeable item that reads, quote, upon dissolution, assets of the corporation will be distributed in a manner consistent with law, unquote. It's in beautiful bright red if you look at the online form. It's not definitely as robust as calling out the 501c3 dissolution specific language we would like, but it at least has something unlike, say, what we just looked at in New Mexico. And then lastly, Section 9 asks for the names and addresses of all the directors. The form was also very specific that it cannot be handwritten. It must be typewritten. So I don't know what that means about people's typing skills or handwritten. They don't teach them cursive in Utah anymore or something. But it was kind of interesting.
It's different.
And yes. And like New Mexico, though, Utah does allow for you to draft your own articles. They actually have an online PDF guide that you can follow. I put the links to that. It's actually very helpful. It says if you type this, type that. I think the most similar I would say to a state that has that is the Delaware forms, where they're just, here's an outline of what we would like. So Utah gives you that as well.
So on the handwritten version, you practice long enough and you will have seen handwritten articles of incorporation from a long, long time ago. And they are just awful to try to read.
Yes, or worse, they're typed and they have handwritten notes where they annotated them and the state took them with the annotations.
Yeah, so I just don't remember seeing a previous state that had to call this out. I guess Utah was thinking ahead a little bit more than some of the other states. So anyway, moving on to the foreign nonprofit that wants to solicit or do business in Utah. How does that process look?
For a foreign nonprofit, they have an application for authority to conduct affairs for a foreign corporation. This is also a one-page form, and it's for both profit and non-profit corporations, and it starts with a checkbox to mark which it is. We've seen this in a couple of our other states. The same basics, your name, your address, your registered agent, when you commenced business in Utah. Section 9 does ask for the names and addresses of all the directors and officers. Section 10 is the business purpose. At the end, it also has the option of whether the business is female-owned or minority-owned.
Interesting.
It's more towards a stock corporation than a nonprofit, but it's still something interesting that they're tracking that in Utah. And the same caveat, don't use your pen or your pencil. Please type the form.
So talk a little bit about the cost and any privacy concerns when filing in Utah.
The filing fee for both the domestic and the foreign is $30 here. So again, we're talking a very reasonably low-priced state here. And for the privacy, in the domestic, you need to identify your directors. And for the foreign, both the officers and the directors. And again, it's just an address. It doesn't say that it has to be their home address, which we saw. That seemed much more of a East Coast thing where we saw that. We get out here to the West, we're a little more laissez-faire. Just say, hey, give me an address and we'll find you. That continues into the annual reports.
So how quick are they at turnaround time on processing these formations and registrations?
They seem to be pretty fast. Per the Utah Division of Corporations website, as of June 28th, they were processing formations filed on June 25th. So that's 3 business days, basically. They do have a $75 expedite available as well, which is a 1 to 2 business days. But quite frankly, the current turnaround is very close to that. At least it was at the end of June here into July of 24. So I would check that on their website. Again, there's a link to their specific processing time link to do that to determine whether you need to spend the additional $75 or not.
All right. So annual or biannual filings, what do we need to do in Utah, and what's the fee for those?
An annual report is due for both domestic and foreign nonprofits. The domestic is due strictly on the anniversary date, while the foreign is due at the end of the anniversary month. So we're recording July 1st. So if I form a domestic nonprofit in Utah today, its report will be due July 1st, 2025. But if I register my foreign nonprofit today, July 1st, I have until July 31st, 2025 for their annual report. Another reminder to think about how you calendar things and make sure that you...
And I guess a note there, we probably should have said this before. You don't have to wait until right before things are due.
No.
If you're in a number of states, you could kind of find the shortest time period or the first one in each year and try to get all of them filed at the same time if you're in multiple places.
No, for sure. So like, for instance, here in California, it's due the end of your month that you form. So like if we form today, July 1st, it would be due July 31st, 2025, but you can start filing them 90 days early. I just was working on one in Hawaii though, and their window is 30 days. So like I have one that's due July 31st and I could start filing that today. So it's best practice to think about it. We generally here, if I'm helping a client track, usually I would give them a month's advance. So anybody that's due at the end of July, I would be sending, did in the case of Hawaii, send an email today saying, hey, you've got till the end of the year or the end of this month. Do you want me to assist you? Or just so you're aware of it, make sure that you know. And sometimes you and I know that starts out, well, why can't we just dissolve the company because I'm not doing anything with it anyway? So, it's a good reminder to everyone to say, hey, what does my business model look like? What am I still doing?
All good advice.
Yes. And the fees, it's $10 for the domestic and $18 for the foreign. So their annual reports are relatively cheap as well.
Closing out on Utah, let's talk about the other state agencies that supervise nonprofit corporations in the state.
Yes, and this goes back to our discussion in changes in law where we started as well. This is our circle coming back. In the past, Utah, if your nonprofit was organized there or if it was a foreign corporation soliciting, holding assets and doing business, you would have been required to obtain a charitable solicitations permit from the Utah Department of Commerce. However, per the website, during the 24 legislative session, the Utah passed House Bill 43, the Charitable Solicitations Act, and effective May 1st of 2024, charitable organizations will no longer be required to submit an annual registration with the Utah Division of Consumer Protection. And then further beginning in April of 2024, the Division of Consumer will no longer accept charitable organization registrations. You will continue to file all the incorporation documents we just talked about with the corporation's commercial code, your annual report, et cetera. But under the new law, certain charities will still be required to upload their most recent 990 as part of that filing process. So we were talking about that in terms of a privacy, certain you will need to, I presume it would probably be like private foundations. We talked about this a couple episodes ago with states where it was Texas, where it was you simply uploaded the 990. So you're seeing that Utah is moving towards that same model. But if we had done this discussion last year when we first started this, I'd be telling you, oh no, you need to file with Utah. You have to file a whole big report and everything annually, which they've changed that. So, as always, there's the website that says they'll promulgate new administrative rules that reflect all these changes, and more information will be posted on the Utah Division of Consumer Protection's website throughout the year regarding this new application process, but that the updates are still forthcoming. So on one level, yes, it's made registration a lot easier in Utah, especially, too, as I looked at the fines used to be quite onerous. They were talking about $15,000 fines when I looked at stuff from last year in terms of not keeping yourself current, which was kind of unusual. We usually don't see fines so top level when you talk about registering your charity.
So it looks like there's a lot in flux here in Utah.
Yes, very much so.
The old way of doing things isn't in effect any longer. And going forward, there will be changes, but we don't know all the details until some application process is described and uploaded and made publicly available.
Made publicly. Exactly.
So a lot changing in Utah. But what about state tax exemption in Utah?
So for both corporate and sales tax exemptions, the charity needs to apply with the Utah State Tax Commission. It's a simple, I'm a 501c3. This is what I do. Here's my determination letter. It was the document was very, very similar to that. And as always, a link to that specific document and all the relevant links to the tax website and all the other departments are found in our show notes.
So it sounds like in California, the state tax exemption is really just a notice that we're exempt and not an application.
No, and it's not really an application per se, no.
Yeah, and the state just piggybacks on the federal determination letter. So that is definitely a nice thing. The separate tax exemption applications were quite onerous since the states almost always followed the feds anyway. So thank you, Joe. I really appreciate you updating or filling us in on New Mexico and Utah, and we'll look for further updates and episodes on the rest of the states. I think we're more than halfway now.
I think so, yes.
So that's all for this episode. Be sure to check out the show notes for the links to all these resources in New Mexico and Utah and links to earlier episodes on the states we've already covered. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Farella, Braun, and Martel has a YouTube channel, and there are several nonprofit playlists, including the one we're building, where all the state filing episodes will be in one place. So look for that link in the show notes as well. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun, and Martel. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.